In this tutorial, we'll be creating a brand new Spring Boot and Spring Security project, and we will implement JWT-based authentication and authorization. We'll create an endpoint that accepts user ID and password and can authenticate, and it returns a JWT. And then we'll wire in some code to check incoming requests for JWT in the authorization header and authorize requests that have valid JWT. So let's check it out. As always, I'm going to start creating a new Spring Boot project by going to start.spring.io. My package is io.javabrains, and I'm going to call this project Spring Security JWT. Now on to the dependencies. I'm going to need the web dependency and the security dependency. These are the only two that I'm going to add for now, and we will add a couple more dependencies later once we have downloaded this project and opened it in IntelliJ. So here's my project open in IntelliJ. The first thing I'm going to do is create an endpoint, and I'm going to call this hello resource, and this is going to be a controller, and this is going to have a single method which is a hello endpoint, which returns a string, hello world. This is nothing special here. Obviously, the only reason I'm doing this is because I have an API that I can put behind an authentication wall so that only someone who has authenticated can access this API. Now, since Spring Security is added to the class path, that's kind of the default behavior for Spring Security. It is going to create a user out of the box, and this /hello is going to be behind that authentication wall, and only that authenticated user can access this API. But we don't want to do that. We want to have some flexibility in this, and we also want to seed a user. So I'm going to use the user service method of overriding the default user behavior. I'm going to create a user data service which returns a static user, and I'm going to seed that in to the Spring Security framework so that it leverages that user data service. So I'm going to create this security class. I'm going to call this security configurer. Extends web security configurer adapter. And now I can use the configure method to set values to the authentication manager builder. All right, I'm going to do the auth.userDetailsService. I'm going to send it my user details service. I don't have this here, of course, so I'm going to have to create it. I'm going to create a field called my user details service, and I'm going to create a class called my user details service as well. All right, so I'm going to create this class, and I'm going to auto wire this. If this is not clear, I highly recommend you check out this tutorial, which explains how to override the user details service. Right, so I'm going to create a new service called user details service, and I'm going to put this in the services package. Now this is going to implement user details service, and this is going to contain a method which Spring Framework is going to call in order to load a user by username. All right, so it's going to pass in this username over here, and it expects your method to load the user based on wherever you've got your user saved. It could be inside a database, it could be somewhere else. What I'm going to do is return a hard-coded user with a certain username. This is fine for the purposes of this tutorial, but this should ideally be whatever is storing your user information in the real world. To return new user, I'm going to use the Spring Security's class called user. See, there's user details.user. I don't even bother to create a new user class. You might want to do that if you have certain specific values that you want to track for your user. All right, so the default constructor for user takes in the username here, which is, I'm going to call it foo. The password, I'm going to call it foo. And then, let's see, a collection of authorities. I'm not dealing with authorities right now, so I'm just going to put an empty list here. New array list. So now what's going to happen is this, I'm going to mark this as a service, of course. So this becomes a Spring service, and then my security configurer is going to result in Spring Security calling this method, and whatever is the authentication manager builder it's going to pass in, I'm going to say, hey, I've got a user detail service, which is this guy, use this. And now Spring Security is going to call my service, and it's going to pass in the username and then say, hey, give me a user with that username. And I'm going to return a user with foo and foo. And now it's going to compare whatever password I've entered with the password over here, which is foo. If it matches, well, and it says authentication successful. So I'm going to enter the password foo and the user foo when I'm trying to log in. Then it should ideally work fine. Now the security configurer also needs an annotation, which is enable web security. This lets Spring Security know that it has to do something with this guy. All right, so now I have a REST API. I have a user detail service, which returns one user, and I have configured Spring Security to rely on the user information provided in the user detail service. There's one last thing for me to do, which is to add a password encoder. I'm going to choose the no-op password encoder because I have specified the password as foo in my user detail service. All right, so I want the Spring Security framework to treat the incoming password as is and not do any hashing. All right, that's the reason I have the no-op password encoder. It's a requirement in order to get your application up and running. But with this, we are kind of done with a basic user credential-based authentication. So far, we have done nothing to do with JWT. All right, this is just a simple user, hard-coded, and then having Spring Security leverage that user. All right, so I'm going to execute this by going to the main method and running it. And now I open a browser and I enter this URL, localhost 8080/hello, which is the endpoint that I've entered. Now when I access it, Spring Security doesn't let me in. For obvious reasons, it expects me to use one of the user IDs and passwords that is in the system. And right now we know that there is just one user in the system. User ID is foo. Password is foo, and when I hit enter, I'm able to see the message, hello world, which is from this controller. Now that we have a Spring Security project working without JWT, now we need to add JWT into the picture. The first thing I'm going to do is add a couple of dependencies into the pom.xml. So I'm going to open the pom.xml and add two dependencies specifically. The first dependency is called JWT. This is a library that lets me create JWTs and also validate existing JWTs. It's kind of a Java library equivalent for whatever we've been playing with in the UI at jwt.io in the previous tutorial. You can create JWTs and you can also parse existing JWTs and verify it. That's this library. The second library I'm going to add is a JAXB API library. This is specifically required because of certain JAXB dependencies, and also specifically because I'm using Java 9 Plus. Any Java 9 Plus version will not have the JAXB dependencies provided in the JDK that got removed as a result of modularity that was introduced in Java 9. So if you're using a Java 9 or newer, you will need to add this as a dependency so that Java X XML bind JAXB APIs are available in the class path. So these are the two dependencies I'm going to add. And next, I'm going to move on to creating a util class. All right, so I'm going to create a class called JWT util. I want to create a class which can abstract out all the JWT related stuff. I want this to be the util class, which allows me to create new JWTs given a user details object, And I also wanted to be able to pull up information from an existing JWT, like look up username from a JWT, look up an expiration date from a JWT, and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to copy paste the code here because there's a lot of code to be written. I don't want to bore you by typing this whole thing. But what I'm going to do is paste this code and walk you through the methods one by one. All right, here's the completed JWT util class. Let's look at the important methods here. The most important method here is the generate token method, which takes in a user details object, right? This is the user details object that our user details service is going to give us. And what I want this method to do is to create a JWT based off of this user details, which means taking the username from the user details, obviously, and baking it into the JWT. So what this is going to do is it's going to call the create token, which is a private method over here. And then it's going to pass in a map of claims, which is currently empty, but you can pass in any other specific claims that you want to include in the JWT, anything that you want to include in the payload. And then you create a JWT for the username that you need, right? So this is the create token. What the create token is going to do is it's going to call the JWT API that we included in the pom.xml just now. It uses a builder pattern, and it is setting the claims that we've passed in. Right now it's an empty object, but again, like I said, this can change. It sets a subject. The subject is the person who is being authenticated, who has successfully authenticated. In this case, I'm using the username over here, right? I'm getting the username, passing that in, and setting that as the subject. And now I can set a bunch of dates. I can set an issued at date, which is the current date. And then I'm also going to set the expiration date, which is the current date plus, I think this is 10 hours here. So this is milliseconds, 1000 plus 60 times 60 times 60, which is going to give hours, and then 10 hours. This can be anything depending on your implementation. All right. So I'm getting the claims, which is empty, setting the subject with his username, setting issued at, which is the current date, expiration, which is 10 hours from now. And now finally, I'm going to be signing this token. I'm going to use the sign with method to sign the token. I'm using this algorithm, signature algorithm.hs256. And then I'm passing in the secret key here. The secret key, I have defined it as string secret. This will obviously need to be something a little more complicated when you're implementing a real application. Then I'm going to do a .compact, which is the end of this whole builder pattern here, right? So this is a builder pattern used by the JWT API that we have chosen for this project. There are a bunch more. You don't have to use this specific API and the specific JWT dependency. This is just the one that I happen to choose, all right? So this is going to do a create token. So anytime you can pass in the user details to this generate token method, and what you're going to get back is a JWT for that user. So you can imagine when somebody authenticates, you will need to create a JWT out of the user details of a successful authentication. And this is what will help you. Okay, now the generate token calls the create token, which basically takes in the claims and takes in your username and then creates a token out of it. The next important method here is the extract claim method, which takes in a token and then it uses a claims resolver in order to figure out what the claims are, right? We have a bunch of data that you have passed in, then this is a way for you to get that out, okay? I'm not going to go into the details of this guy, but basically there are a couple of methods that are using this. So there's an extract username method, which takes in the token and then returns the username from that token. There is an extract expiration, which takes in a token and then it returns the expiration date. So basically what it's doing is it's using this extract claim method to pull information from an existing token. Okay, now there is a token expired method, which returns whether the token is expired or not, which is basically taking the expiration from the token and then seeing if it's before the current date, right? Simple enough. Finally, there is a validate token method, which gets the username using extract username, and then it checks if that username is same as the username in the user details that's passed in, right? So it checks if that's equal. And it also checks that the token has not expired, all right? A couple of handy methods here that we will use in order to both create JWTs and to validate existing JWTs. Okay, now that we have a foundation for JWT, let's look at what we need to do to get this application to work with JWT. Right now we have a form-based login and default credentials that are created from the user data service that we have seeded in. Now, the first thing we need to do is to create an authenticate endpoint. Okay, now we don't need a user ID and password form anymore. We need some API where we can post our user ID and password. That API endpoint does not redirect anywhere. What it should do is return back a JWT in the payload. Okay, the response needs to contain the JWT. And now the client, we're going to assume that the client holds on to that JWT and sends it in subsequent requests in the header. Okay, now we also need to handle that. So we need to create a way where we can examine the incoming request for the header and then get the JWT out of it and then verify that it's valid. If it's valid, we need to make sure that that's in the security context as the currently logged in user. Okay, there's a lot to do. We'll take it one step at a time. The first thing we're going to do is create an authenticate API, which takes in a user ID and a password, and then it returns back a JWT. So before I create the API, what I'm going to do is create a couple of classes which form the input and the output for that method that's acting as a controller. All right, so I'm going to create an authentication request in the models package, and this is going to contain a couple of member variables, username and password. All right, so this authentication request is going to define the input argument to my authenticate method. All right, so this is what the user is going to send in the post request, and I need a class to define what that structure is. Okay, now what I'm going to do is create getters and setters for both, and then I'm going to create a constructor which takes in both as an argument so that it's easy for me to construct something. I'm also going to create a constructor with no arguments because I need this for serialization. Okay, now I have an authentication request. I'm also going to create an authentication response. New Java class, authentication response. What do I need in my response? I just need the JSON web token. All right, so I'm going to have one string member variable, and then I'm going to create a getter for this. And then of course I'm going to use a constructor, which takes this as an argument. Okay, so now I have the input structure for my authenticate method, which takes in the username and the password in the post request. And I have the output structure for my authentication method, which is just a property called JWT in the response with the actual JWT value. Now, what's left to do is to create that authentication endpoint. I'm going to go here to the hello resource, and then I'm going to create this request mapping / authenticate. This is going to take in the username and the password as an input argument. It's going to return the JWT. Okay, what does this method look like? The annotation needs to be authenticate with the request method being post. Okay, it's not a get now, it's a post request because the user is going to be sending the username and the password in the post body. Okay, next, I'm going to create this method definition called create authentication token, which takes in the authentication request, an instance of the authentication request. And it's annotated with request body so that we know that it's parsing the request body to get the username and the password from the request body. And then the response is the response entity, and we are going to be creating a response entity out of the authentication response class that we've created. Okay, next, I'm able to get the username and the password from the authentication request, right? Spring MVC is going to set this in my instance. Now I need to actually authenticate it. In order to authenticate, I need to get a handle to the authentication manager. So what I'm going to do here is create an instance of, a member variable of authentication manager, which is going to be auto-wired. All right, I'm going to get the authentication manager instance auto-wired in, and then I'm going to use this authentication manager instance in order to authenticate a new username and password authentication token, and I'm going to get it the authentication request dot get username, authentication request dot get password, right? So I'm going to get this username password authentication token, which is the standard token that Spring MVC uses for username and password. Okay, and I'm going to call authentication manager dot authenticate. Now, if this authentication fails, there is an exception. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to handle the exception here by putting this inside a try catch block. Okay, now the try catch here, let me move this thing over here. So what's happening here is if this authentication fails, I'm going to catch it with the bad credentials exception. I'm going to throw an exception saying this is an incorrect username or password. Okay, now when you complete this execution, this means that the authentication has succeeded. What happens next? Well, if the authentication is successful, then this method needs to return the JWT, right? Now, remember, in order to return the JWT, I need to create a JWT. And we have created a util which takes in the user details in order to create a JWT out of it. So I need to get access to the user details, which means that I need to fetch the user details from the user details service. All right, so I'm going to get the user details using the user details service .load user by username. I have the username. I can get the user details out of it. Of course, I need to auto wire the user details service first, which I'm going to do over here. Okay, now I have the user details service. I use the user details service in order to get the user details. Now that I have the user details, I can use the JWT util that we have created in order to get the JWT out of this user details. So I will need to, of course, auto wire the JWT util, and then I can call the generate token, pass in the user details, and I get the JWT. Of course, I'm going to create a member variable here, JWT util, and I'm calling the generate token method of it. Now that I have the token, all I need to do is create a authentication response instance and pass it back by creating a response entity out of it. Right? This is standard REST API. So I call the response entity.ok, which means that Spring MVC is going to return a 200 OK, and the payload of the response is going to be new authentication response of JWT. And authentication response is our class that we've created for this very purpose. Okay, to recap, we created an authenticate method, an endpoint, which is mapped to the create authentication token. This takes in authentication request, which is basically the payload in the post body, which contains the username and the password. I'm using authentication manager in order to authenticate with the username and the password that is passed in. If it does not authenticate, I throw an exception. If it does authenticate, all I need to do is create a JWT token. The JWT token util needs user details in order to create a JWT. So I'm going to call the user details service .load user by username, because all I have is username at this point, right? Somebody is authenticated with the username and a password. All I have is username. I'm going to get an instance to the user details, and I'm going to pass that in to the JWT token util to get the JWT, and then I'm going to put that in an authentication response and send it back. Now with this, I have an endpoint which does authentication. Now here is a problem. I cannot call this without authenticating first, because remember, Spring Security is putting an authentication around everything. We couldn't call hello directly. We had to authenticate to call the /hello. Similarly, it will expect us to authenticate to call the /authenticate, which is ridiculous. So we need to tell Spring Security to say, hey, when somebody calls this /authenticate endpoint, don't expect the user to have been authenticated. So what I need to do is go to the security configurer here, and then I need to specify a method override for HTTP security over here. All right, I'm going to paste this piece of code here. And what this does is it disables cross-site request forgery, and then it authorizes requests for /authenticate, basically saying permit everybody for /authenticate. And then any other request needs to be authenticated. All right, so we are basically saying, hey, Spring Security, for this particular API, feel free to let anybody in. For everything else, ensure that they are authenticated. Okay, now let me actually execute this. And you can see our API actually accepting username and password, which is foo-foo, and then it returns a JWT. If this works, you might have an issue with this particular bean. You remember I have this auto wire authentication manager. Okay, this used to work in an older version of Spring Boot, but this is one of the backward incompatible updates to the newer version of Spring Boot, specifically Spring Boot 2.0. So in order to make this to work, I need to define a bean of Authentication Manager. Earlier, there used to be a default implementation of Authentication Manager that you could inject. That's not the case anymore. So here's what you need to do. Go to your security configurer, which extends Web Security Configure Adapter, and then add a method here, override the Authentication Manager bean method, and just return the super. All you need to do is add this add bean annotation to this guy so that Spring Security, or Spring rather, knows that there is a bean called Authentication Manager. There used to be this default bean, but it doesn't exist anymore. So all you're doing here is creating that bean and then not doing anything special. You're just passing the super, which is whatever is the Authentication Manager bean in this parent class. You're just passing that in. Okay. Now that you have done this, Spring Security is going to say, hey, I have this Authentication Manager. Now I can inject it into my hello resource. All right. So let's run this again. And this time, the application should be running fine. Now what I'm going to do is make a post request to the /authenticate method using Postman. So here's my post request. I have the method as post. The URL is localhost 8080/authenticate. And the header has content type application /JSON. And in my body, I'm passing the username and password as foo and foo, because this is what our user detail service expects. And this is what the authenticate endpoint is verifying against. Okay, so I'm going to hit send. What's going to happen is authentication is going to succeed, and it's going to take that user detail and create a JWT token out of it and return it in the response. And there you go. We have a response with our JWT built in, which is awesome. Okay, now this JWT is something that you would hope a client holds on to either in local storage or in the cookie or wherever else, and it passes to an API on a subsequent request. Okay, so let's say I make a GET request to /hello. This does not work right now because it says access denied. What you would hope is that in the headers, I can create a authorization header and then bearer and the JWT. Now, this should work once you have implemented JWT support. Right now, we don't have JWT support. All you have is a separate endpoint which returns a JWT value, but it has nothing to do with Spring Security. Now, what you need to do is tell Spring Security to listen to every request for this particular header, authorization header. And when there is a bearer and blah, take this blah out, treat it as a JWT, extract the username out of it, right? Verify it's a valid JWT. If it's a valid JWT, then you know that the person who's sending this JWT is trustworthy, so you can blindly rely on the contents of the JWT, get the username, and put it into the security context. So this is all the stuff that needs to be done now. All right, now how do I do this? The way to intercept a request and look at the header is by creating a filter. There are a bunch of filters that are already available. What you need to do is to extend one of those filters and implement the filter method yourself. All right, I'm going to create a new filter here. in the filters package. I'm going to call it JWT request filter, right? So this is the filter that is going to intercept every request just once and then examine the header, right? So I'm going to have this intercept every request only once by extending the right filter. And it just so happens there is a filter called once per request filter. It's a great name for a filter that runs once per request. This is the filter that I'm going to be extending. Here there's a method called doFilterInternal, all right? So this is the method which actually does the job. Okay, now this method, doFilterInternal, takes in a bunch of arguments. It takes in a request, takes in a response, and it takes in the filter chain because it has the option of passing on to the next filter in the filter chain or actually ending the request right there. What it needs to do is to examine the incoming request for the JWT in the header, right? It's going to look at the right header and see if that JWT is valid. If it finds a valid JWT, it's going to get the user details out of the user details service and save it in the security context. This is all that this filter needs to do, okay? So because of this, it needs a bunch of dependencies. It needs the user details service in order to get the user details. And if it finds a JWT in the header, it needs JWT util in order to verify if it's a valid JWT, right? And to also pull up the username from it. Let me actually create these two member variables here and then auto-wire them so that Spring gives access to them. And I'm also going to make this as a component because again, this needs to be in Spring's radar in order to auto-wire this. Okay, now that I have all the raw materials that I need in order to validate the header, let me actually get to it. Is get the header for the authorization. I'm going to do request.getHeader and the authorization, and I'm going to get the authorization header. If this has a valid JWT authorization header, this header string should contain bearer space and then the JWT. So what I'm going to do next is initialize a couple of variables, username and JWT. And now I'm going to verify if the authorization header is not null and if it starts with bearer space. Okay, that means that what's coming after this in the authorization header is the JWT. So I'm going to do a substring of 7, which is basically leaving out bearer space, which means substring of 7 is going to give you the JWT directly. All right, now that I have the JWT, I'm going to use the JWT util.extract username, passing in the JWT, and I'm going to get the username. All right, now that I have the username, I need to extract the user details from this. So what I'm going to do is the username is not null, and there's this one condition which I'm going to get back to in a little bit. Okay, the username is not null. I'm going to get user details service dot load user by username, passing in the username. I'm going to get the user details. Now that I have the user details, I will validate the token with the user details. Remember, the JWT util has a validate token method which takes in both the JWT and the user details because it needs to know if the JWT is valid for the given user. Okay, so this will verify if the username matches and the JWT has not expired. Okay, if it's not expired, then I'm going to create the username password authentication token, which is the default token. We've already seen this, right? This is what Spring Security uses for managing authentication in the context of username and password. Okay, so I'm going to create a new username and password authentication token, and I'm going to set the details, which is basically what's in the request. So what I'm doing here is what would have happened by default, but since I've taken over, I'm doing this only under one condition, and the condition is if the JWT is valid. If the JWT is valid, I'm simulating normal flow of operation. All right, so this is what Spring Security would have automatically done. And then of course I'm setting it into the context, which is also another thing that Spring Security would have automatically done, but I'm doing this only in the case of a valid JWT. And of course, notice here now this should make sense. I am verifying that something has not already gone into the security context. So even though I get a username from the JWT, I am going to simulate putting that into the user context only if that user context does not already have an authenticated user. All right, Now I do this. And then, of course, at the end of this all, I need to continue the chain. So I need to say chain.doFilter. I'm passing in the request and the response. I'm basically saying, okay, I've done my job. I entered the filter chain and I did my job. And now the rest of you filters, whoever is doing what, you just continue doing your job. All right. So it's basically handing off the control to the next filter in the filter chain. Okay. So now that I have this, the last piece of the puzzle is to go to the security configurer and then tell it to use that filter chain. Just putting a filter is not enough. I need to interject it into the filter chain. Add session management to be stateless. I'm basically saying, hey, Spring Security, don't manage sessions. All right, don't create a session, because the whole reason we are doing JWT is to make it stateless. So this basically tells Spring Security not to bother creating a session. Okay, well, if Spring Security is not creating a session, there needs to be something that works for each request and sets up the security context each time. Well, and that's where this line comes in. I'm basically adding a filter before the username password authentication filter. I am passing in the filter that I created. Well, this filter, of course, I need to auto wire here. Okay, so this is the filter that we just created. I'm basically saying, hey, Spring Security, make sure this filter is called before the username password filter is called. Okay, now with this, we are finally done, I think. Let's run this. I'm going to go back to the post request for authenticate, the header and the body. Click send. I'm going to get back this JWT. I'm going to take this JWT, make this a get request to hello, and I'm going to try without the JWT first. Okay, so there's nothing in the header. I'm going to try without the JWT. I'm going to get access denied, but I'm going to do authorization and then bearer and then the JWT, and I hit send. This time it works because now our filter is looking at this and setting it in the context. And when it comes to this API, well, user is authenticated. Now, if I were to make another request here, just to prove that there are no sessions, let's say I remove this guy, I make a request, it's forbidden again because there is no state on the server. It's looking at each request. It has no memory of a previous occurrence. Put this JWT back in the header, and this should work again. All right. So this was setting up a Spring Boot Spring Security project from the scratch to work with JWT. The only deviation from a real world application that we have done here is that we are not connecting to a live user resource. We're not connecting to a database to get the users. We are just hard coding with one user, but it should be very easy to see how this gets extended to connecting to a database. You would just need to change your user detail service to connect to an actual user repository to get user details for a given username rather than a hard-coded list. But in summary, this tutorial, we created an API endpoint which accepts username and password and returns a fully formed JWT. And then we also intercepted each request to our Spring Security API to listen to that JWT in the header, parse it, verify it, and then if it's verified and valid, set the security context so that the rest of the Spring Security framework doesn't know the difference. It just assumes it's a valid user if the JWT is valid.